Good evening and welcome to Doc TV, Open Talk, the format, the video format and the channel of the Dialogue of Civilizations here in Berlin. Let me introduce to you the two guests of today. Andrey Kortunov to my left, the director of the Russian International Affairs Council, founded in 2010 and already regarded as the most prestigious Russian foreign affairs think tank. To my right, Professor Peter Schulze from Göttingen University, co-founder of the Research Institute Dialogue of Civilizations. The subject of today's lecture by Mr. Kortunov will be the new or future Russian foreign policy, having in mind the actuality of the day, the ongoings in Syria, the utterings from both sides on the US and Russia. My first question to you, Andrei, would be, what do we have to expect in terms of new features of Russian foreign policy under a new Russian government?
Well, if I were to speculate about the immediate future, I would venture to say that it will be mostly about crisis management, because we have many crises around us. Of course, the Ukrainian crisis, but also Syria and the recent unfortunate incident in Salisbury. There are many issues that have to be taken into account. However, if you take a longer-term perspective, probably the main goal of the Russian foreign policy will be to provide international resources to serve the Russian modernization.
We have, in coming back to the actual situation, we have seen in the German media, but also in discussions among the German public, there is an acute sense of risk of war. Would you say that this sense of this risk is shared by people and the elite in Russia?
Well, frankly, I don't have an impression that either in the West or in Russia people are really scared of a war. I'm old enough to remember the real Cold War, and I can tell you that back in the 1980s, we were really concerned about a nuclear war. I think that today they take a lighter approach, probably because we entered a postmodern world, because a war is seen almost as a computer game. But I don't see the anxiety and the concern that was there some 30 years ago.
Peter, what do the Germans expect of the foreign policy of the new Russian government?
I think at the moment not much continuation of the old pattern, and there is no real assessment of analysis of Russia. There is no way of trying to understand Russia from within by putting themselves into the shoes of how Russian foreign policy makers and security experts think and why they act the way they act. In regard to the Syrian crisis, I mean, let's think about Sarajevo. There can be an accident, and it needs to be a kind of an accident which is deliberately provoked and will, of course, then met by the retaliation. And then we have not anymore kind of a local crisis which is fought out by military means, but it can escalate into something of a larger crisis or even a war, and it is very clear that both sides know once you open the gates of hell, then the nuclear issue comes in. And this is exactly what is much more in the public opinion in Germany. For example, yesterday and the day before, we issued an appeal to more rational thinking and coming back to terms and building confidence. And this was even done today by an open letter of respected German politicians and science people in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And I think the parts of the intelligentsia in Germany are afraid. They are afraid of the uncalculated, uncontrollable risks of a crisis spilling out of control.
War by accident, unchecked escalation, is that so impossible?
Well, I don't think it's impossible, and in my opinion, if we compare the situation today with the Cold War, it's not the Cold War of 1970s or 1980s, it's the Cold War of early 1950s, when there were no red lines and no rules of the game were established. There are some scholars who argue that in order to move back to arms control and to some kind of stability, we have to live through a new Cuban Missile Crisis, that we should look into the abyss, and then probably there'll be a change in the thinking. But of course, this is a very risky proposition, because this time probably we will not be as lucky as we were back in 1962.
Yeah. And we have a different president in office.
Well,
Yeah. And we have a split in the American foreign and security expert community and with the government. Basically, all the grown-ups like Rex Tillerson and others left office, and they were replaced by people who are close to Tea Party positions. This means aggressive politics exerted against Russia, or interference in the Iranian case. So I mean, we are living today in a much more vulnerable situation, and I agree with Andrey totally. But what was there after the Cuban crisis, and there were communication links, there were institutions, there were agreements. This is all gone basically, and now we are we have not the instruments and the tools anymore to manage the crisis situation. Look at the Ukrainian situation, for example. What happened immediately after in 2014? The only institution which could have done something of de-escalating the problem, the NATO-Russia Council, was shut down. Yeah, and it was not shut down because the Russians wanted it. Yeah, it was shut down of Western initiative, and that makes me really fearful of the future. We are living in real troubled times at the moment.
There are experts who argue that although the war is cold, it does not so much resemble the classical Cold War of the 50s and 60s, but more the situation of multipolar power, European powers around 1913, 1914. And the being so far away from that situation, the not remembering it, makes the whole constellation much more contingent and unpredictable. What would be your position there?
Well, I think that there are similarities and dissimilarities. I would say that the major difference, in my opinion, was that nationalism really flew very high in 1914. Major constituencies of people in Russia, in Germany, in France, they wanted to fight. Today we don't have these constituencies, in my opinion, but the tragedy is that politicians don't even need these constituencies, because no longer they need massive armies, no longer they need mobilization. If there is a war today, it will be again almost like a computer game, but we will all suffer, and that's why it's not a consolation. In my opinion, I agree with Peter, we have to restore communication lines to start with. And by the way, Peter, I'd like also to add, if you compare the situation with the situation early 60s or even in 70s, these generation of leaders who led our countries in 1960s and 70s, they did remember the horrors of the Second World War. And that was a major, major factor which set the system of priorities. They were committed to make everything possible not to allow anything like that to happen again. Today, the leaders do not have this experience, and that might be one of the reasons why they engage in such a risky behavior.
Who should talk, Peter? The leaders, the presidents, the generals, the advisors?
Of course they have to be addressed. The question is how. Because if the media is hostile and is not willing to open up and to propose as well an alliance of argumentation towards a reconciliation and a more improved and a relationship between East and West, that means Russia and the European Union or the United States, then you have only one chance: to make as many as possible public events conferences, speeches, whatever you have, work with the social media, and try to sober the debate and get it out of the hysteria which is floating around at the moment to destruct antagonistic narratives.
So would you say that the ideologist media today, in a way, replace the push factor by the nationalist constituencies of 100 years ago?
I think so, yes. I think so, yes. And this is a totally new phenomenon. We are not used to, and we cannot control it, because look at the incredible changes we suddenly see in forming new governments. Political parties, political movements coming out of nowhere, out of the blue, basically, and they are destructing or destroying the relationships by very antagonistic attitudes towards new faux images are being created, and there is not a real sober intellectual community or a political agent like the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Party in the 70s who could act in regard to normalization. Yeah, it is gone.
One last question to Andrey. What should be done, concretely done, in order, or who should talk to who, in order to somehow circumvent this negative influence of public opinion today on all sides, if it exists, as Peter says?
First of all, I think that we should restore the firewall between analysis and propaganda. Unfortunately, this firewall has almost disappeared. I think it's about integrity of researchers, about the responsibility of intellectuals. I don't know how to do that, but that has to be done. They should feel that they are responsible, that they are not just serving their masters. If they do that, then we can start saturating media, and we can start working with the political establishments in our respective countries.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andrey. We continue to hope for peace in our times.